You are in the silence, doing the work, rebuilding the interior that the dynamic gradually occupied. Returning to yourself with the kind of deliberate, daily, unglamorous commitment that genuine healing actually requires, rather than the cinematic version that announces itself with clarity and momentum. And somewhere on the other side of the silence, the person who withdrew is doing something. You cannot see it. You have, ideally, stopped organizing your attention around the question of what it is. But the question visits anyway, in the quiet moments, with the specific persistence of something that has not been fully answered. What does the avoidant actually do during no contact? Not what the theory predicts, not what the hopeful version of the story requires. What actually happens in the behavioral, observable, sometimes confusing and often contradictory reality of a person whose attachment system is running in the absence of the usual relational context that gave it something to organize against. The answer is stranger than most people expect. Not stranger in the dramatic sense, stranger in the quiet, specific, psychologically coherent sense of behaviors that seem contradictory until the interior logic that produces them becomes visible. 7 of those behaviors are worth examining honestly, not as proof of anything, not as the foundation of a conclusion about what to do next, but as accurate information about what no contact actually produces in the avoidant's daily experience. The first strange thing the avoidant does during no contact is check without contacting. This is perhaps the most universally reported and least universally understood behavior in the entire no-contact landscape. The checking takes whatever form the available technology permits: the viewing of a profile, the watching of a story, the noting of an update, the brief and apparently purposeless visit to a digital space where evidence of your continued existence is available without the vulnerability of direct contact. The strangeness of this behavior, from the outside, is its apparent irrationality. If the avoidant is checking, they are thinking about you. If they are thinking about you, the no contact is not producing the indifference it might appear to produce from the outside. So why check without contacting? Why gather the information without acting on whatever the information produces? The answer is in the specific function the checking serves, which is not the same as the function contact would serve. Checking allows the avoidant to reduce uncertainty without incurring the vulnerability cost of direct engagement. The uncertainty being reduced is not primarily about you, it is about the interior state that your absence has produced. The checking is the avoidant's nervous system verifying, without having to acknowledge that verification is happening, that the object of the disruption still exists, still continues, still is. The checking is not about you as a person. It is about the avoidant's own interior regulation, specifically the low-level anxiety that genuine loss produces in a system that suppresses its attachment needs rather than processing them. The anxiety quiets briefly when the checking confirms continued existence, not because the avoidant is consciously relieved, because the attachment system, running beneath the conscious level, receives the information it was reaching for. What makes this strange is that the checking is entirely private, produces nothing external, changes nothing about the situation. The avoidant checks, the interior quiets slightly, the checking stops, until the interior builds back to the threshold that produces the impulse to check again. It is a cycle that runs entirely in the background, generating no visible behavior beyond the checking itself, and that most avoidants would be deeply uncomfortable acknowledging as the attachment system activity it actually is. The second strange thing is the performance of being fine directed at no audience. During no contact, the avoidant invests unusual energy in the demonstration of okayness in contexts where you will not see it. The social media activity that presents a full and active life. The engagement with activities that communicate self-sufficiency. The projection into the world of someone who is exactly as unbothered as they have always claimed to prefer to be. The strangeness is that this performance continues even when, especially when, there is no likelihood of it reaching you. When the channels through which you might observe it have been closed. When the demonstration is being made into a void. What is happening here is the avoidant performing for an internalized version of you. The audience is interior rather than exterior. Because you have become, in the avoidant psychological landscape, an internal presence, a representation of the one person whose perception of their self-sufficiency matters in a way that most people's perception does not. The performance of okayness is directed at that internal representation, at the imagined gaze of someone whose knowing of the avoidant's actual interior makes the maintenance of the self-sufficient presentation feel specifically necessary in a way it does not feel necessary in relation to people who have only ever engaged with the surface. The performance for the internalized audience reveals something the avoidant would not choose to reveal, that your perception of them matters, that the internal representation of you is sufficiently real and sufficiently significant that the avoidant is regulating their behavior in relation to it, even in your physical absence. The genuine self-sufficiency that the dismissive identity claims would not require this, would not produce this specific, directed, nobody-watching performance. The performance is the evidence of the investment, running in the background, shaping behavior in the absence of any external audience to justify it. The third strange thing is the disproportionate irritability that emerges in unrelated contexts. People around the avoidant during no contact often notice a quality of friction in their engagement, a low threshold for annoyance, a slightly sharper edge to the communication, a quality of impatience or dissatisfaction that attaches itself to whatever is most available without appearing to have a consistent or proportionate source. This irritability is not about what it attaches to. It is the behavioral expression of the suppressed grief and disruption that the no contact has initiated, routed through the management system's preferred alternative to direct emotional expression. The avoidant cannot, will not, acknowledge the grief directly, cannot sit with the loss as loss and allow it the full, present, honest expression that grief requires for genuine processing. So it comes out sideways, as irritability, as the low-level friction of someone whose interior is carrying more than their ordinary self-regulation is adequately processing, expressed not as sadness or longing, but as the edge that appears in interactions with colleagues, in responses to minor inconveniences, in the specific sharpness that surfaces when the interior pressure has been building without adequate release. The people around the avoidant experience this without understanding its source. The avoidant experiences it without fully understanding its source either, because connecting the irritability to the loss would require the same acknowledgement of genuine impact that the management system is organized to prevent. So the irritability floats, attaching to available targets, expressing the interior weather through the only channel the management system permits. The fourth strange thing is the sudden, apparently sourceless preoccupation with the past. During no contact, avoidants often find themselves revisiting not just the recent relationship, but their broader relational history. Old memories surface with unusual frequency and unusual emotional weight. Relationships from years ago become unexpectedly present in the interior, carrying a quality of reflection that their ordinary, forward-moving, don't-look-back psychology does not typically generate. What is happening is the loss in the present activating the unprocessed losses of the past. The avoidance suppression of grief is not specific to the current situation. It is a general strategy that has been applied to every significant loss throughout their relational history. None of those losses were fully processed. The grief was each time managed, minimized, rerouted, and stored rather than metabolized. And the current loss, specifically because of its particular weight, specifically because of the empath's quality of having reached something the others did not reach, is pressing on the accumulated, unprocessed weight of everything that came before. The past surfaces because the present has opened something that was sealed. The empath's loss is the most recent pressure point on a structure that has been carrying unprocessed weight for a long time. And in the no contact, with the ordinary forward momentum of relational engagement temporarily stilled, the structure is encountering the full, accumulated weight in a way it does not usually have to. This is not comfortable for the avoidant. It produces a quality of interior heaviness that their explanatory frameworks cannot adequately account for. The past that is surfacing is not being processed. The avoidance relationship with their own emotional history does not suddenly become fluent simply because the history is surfacing. But the surfacing itself is significant. It is the pressure of the accumulated, unmetabolized grief looking for an exit, finding none that the management system approves of, pressing harder. The fifth strange thing is the testing behavior that precedes contact. Before the avoidant breaks the no contact directly, before any reaching out occurs, there is often a period of indirect, deniable, testing without committing behavior. The proximity without contact. The appearance in shared digital or physical spaces in ways that are observable but do not require acknowledgement. The behavior that is organized around gathering information about your accessibility and your current emotional orientation toward them without the vulnerability of asking directly. This testing is the avoidance attachment system and management system in negotiation. The attachment system is generating the impulse toward contact. The management system is refusing to permit contact in any form that would require direct acknowledgement of the impulse. The testing behavior is the compromise, a way of moving toward the object of the impulse without the full vulnerability cost of the direct movement. The strangeness of it is its self-defeating quality. The testing rarely produces the clarity it is reaching for because it is operating through channels that cannot provide clear information about what it actually needs to know. Whether you are genuinely available in the way that the attachment system is reaching for, not digitally visible but genuinely, relationally, in your actual life available, is not something that indirect proximity can determine. The testing circles the question without answering it, and the circling can continue for a significant amount of time before the impulse toward direct contact either generates the directness required or is successfully managed back into suppression. The sixth strange thing is the atypical vulnerability that appears in the avoidance other relationships during no contact. People who are ordinarily on the receiving end of the avoidance managed, self-sufficient, I've got it handled presentation sometimes notice in this period a quality of openness that was not previously available. Not dramatic openness, not the full defenses down vulnerability that the empath was reaching for throughout the dynamic, but small, uncharacteristic expressions of difficulty. Moments where the composure is slightly less complete, where something real surfaces in the texture of a conversation that would normally remain entirely contained. What is happening is the empath's influence on the avoidance interior expressing itself in the only currently available direction. The empath reached something in the avoidant, genuinely, permanently, in the ways that have been examined throughout this series. That reaching changed something in the interior's relationship to its own experience, made the defended layer slightly more permeable, slightly more capable of finding its way toward expression than it was before the connection occurred. The empath is gone, but the permeability remains, and the slightly more permeable interior is now, in the pressure of no contact and the disruption of the accumulated loss, finding occasional exits in the relationships that are present. The vulnerability that appears in those relationships is, in a very real sense, the empath's legacy in the avoidant psychology. The small, permanent, not going back to exactly what it was, change that genuine contact with someone who saw the real version and did not withdraw from it produces. The seventh strange thing is the most interior and the least behavioral, and therefore the hardest to observe from outside, but the most significant in terms of what it indicates about the no contact's effect on the avoidant psychological structure. It is the change in the quality of the avoidant solitude. The avoidant has always spent significant time alone. The solitude has been, throughout their relational history, a primary comfort, the place where the management strategies can rest, where the self-sufficient identity can be inhabited without the effort of maintaining it against the pressure of other people's emotional presence. The solitude was safe, nourishing in the specific self-contained way that the avoidant psychology finds nourishing, genuinely preferred. During no contact, particularly when the no contact follows the loss of an empath whose presence reached the actual interior, the quality of the solitude changes. It becomes, for the first time in the avoidance experience of it, slightly less entirely comfortable, slightly less the uncomplicated refuge it has always been. There is something in it now that was not in it before, a quality of awareness of itself that the solitude previously did not carry, an awareness of being alone that is different from the preference for being alone. the specific, quiet, initially barely perceptible difference between chosen solitude and felt aloneness. The empath's presence, the specific quality of her genuine, accurate, non-judgmental engagement with the avoidant's actual interior, made the solitude visible as a choice in a way it had not previously been visible. Made the not needing anyone premise available to examination in a way the premise had not previously been available. And now, in her absence, the solitude that was always the comfortable baseline carries a faint, persistent, genuinely new quality of something being present in it that was not present before. Not longing exactly, not grief exactly, something in the register of recognition. The interior, slightly more permeable than it was before the empath, recognizing itself as alone in a way that is qualitatively different from its previous experience of aloneness. This recognition is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not produce dramatic behavior or visible crisis or the kind of external disruption that would make it easy to identify as the significant interior event it is. It is simply there, in the changed quality of the quiet, in the specific texture of the solitude that will never be quite what it was before the empath arrived and genuinely reached what she reached. That changed texture is perhaps the most honest evidence of all that the no contact is working. Not working toward an outcome, not working toward return or change or the transformation of the avoidant into someone capable of what the relationship required. Working in the only way that actually matters, working toward the truth of what was there between them, the truth of what the avoidance pattern cost, the truth of what the interior actually contains beneath the management and the rules and the carefully maintained premise of not needing. The truth, sitting in the changed quality of the solitude, in the quiet that will never be quite the same quiet again, that she was real, that it was real, that real things, genuinely encountered, do not simply return to their pre-encounter state when the encounter ends. They leave something. She left something, in the only place that was ever actually worth reaching. And the solitude, in its changed and permanent quality, knows it. Even when everything else the avoidant does is organized around not knowing it, the solitude knows. The solitude knows. And what it knows, sitting with that knowledge in the changed quality of the quiet, is something the avoidant cannot entirely manage back into the framework that made the silence feel like strength. The framework held for a long time. It held through previous relationships, through previous endings, through the various forms of loss that the avoidance pattern reliably produces and that the management strategies reliably contain. The framework is sophisticated. It is not fragile. It does not collapse under ordinary pressure. But the empath was not ordinary pressure, and the changed quality of the solitude is the evidence of that. Not dramatic evidence, not the kind that announces itself in ways that make the avoidance interior disruption visible from outside. Simply the persistent, low-level, impossible to entirely root around quality of a quiet that has been altered by something genuine. That carries, now, an awareness it did not carry before. What the awareness contains, in its simplest and most honest form, is this: the self-sufficiency that the solitude always represented, that it still represents in many functional respects, is not the complete account of what the avoidant is. There is more to the interior than the self-sufficiency manages. More longing, more need, more genuine hunger for the specific quality of connection that the empath briefly, imperfectly, against the architecture provided. And the more is not going away simply because the architecture is reasserting itself. It is there, in the solitude, altered by the encounter, carrying the specific weight of having been, however briefly, fed. This weight in the solitude does something over time that is worth understanding clearly, rather than leaving as an abstract observation. It accumulates. Not the way ordinary grief accumulates, the gradual fading accumulation of something that diminishes as time creates distance. It accumulates in the specific way of something whose source is internal rather than external. Because the changed quality of the solitude is not a response to an external condition that will shift as circumstances change. It is a response to an internal alteration that the encounter with the empath produced, an alteration that is permanent in the way that genuine contact with another person always leaves permanent traces. The avoidant cannot outrun this accumulation by moving forward, cannot resolve it by filling the solitude with activity or new connections, or the forward momentum that has always been the most reliable tool for keeping the interior's more demanding contents at a manageable distance. Those tools work for what they were designed for. They were not designed for the specific, interior-located, permanently installed quality of an altered solitude. They slide off it, do their work in the layers above it, leave it unchanged beneath. Over time, the unchanged quality beneath begins to produce something, not immediately, not on any timeline that the hope can usefully organize around, but genuinely, in the slow and largely invisible way that genuine interior pressure eventually finds expression. It begins to produce a different quality of question in the avoidant's private accounting. The question is not romantic. It is not organized around the empath specifically, though she is its proximate cause. It is a more fundamental question about the framework itself, about whether the self-sufficiency that the solitude has always represented is actually serving the life it is organized to protect, whether the protection is producing something worth protecting, whether the architecture that keeps the interior manageable is also, in ways that the changed solitude is now making difficult to entirely ignore, keeping the interior from being genuinely inhabited. That question is the most significant thing the empath's presence and subsequent absence has produced in the avoidant. More significant than the disruption, more significant than the rule breaking, more significant than the strange behaviors that no contact generates, or the falling that follows the rejection, or any of the external behavioral observable evidence of the dynamic's impact. The interior question, the private, honest, not organized around any audience reckoning with whether the framework is serving the life, is the thing with genuine potential. The thing that, if genuinely engaged with rather than managed past, could produce something real. It could produce the beginning of the work. Not the work of returning to the empath, not organized around her or toward her or in service of any particular relational outcome. The work of the interior itself, of the avoidant's genuine, private, sustained engagement with the question of why the solitude changed, what the empath reached that changed it, why the reaching produced the specific disruption it produced, rather than the ordinary friction of a connection that was simply not the right fit. What that specificity indicates about what the interior actually contains beneath the management, and what it would require, genuinely, not hypothetically, not as a concept, but as a daily, behavioral, against the conditioning practice, to inhabit that interior more honestly. This is worth naming clearly, because it is the piece of the avoidance potential trajectory that is most frequently collapsed, in discussions of this dynamic, into the question of whether they will return to the empath. The return is not the most important thing the disruption could produce. It is not even the most interesting thing. The most important thing is the work, the genuine, interior, sustained engagement with the question of what the framework costs and whether the cost is worth paying indefinitely. That work has value independent of whether it produces a relationship with anyone. It has value for the avoidant's own life, their own interior, their own capacity to be genuinely present in the solitude and in the connection, and in the full range of their own experience, rather than managing it from the careful remove that the architecture requires. If the work happens, if the question the changed solitude is asking gets genuinely engaged with, rather than managed past, what it produces over time is a person who is incrementally less organized around the suppression of their own attachment needs, less reflexively defensive when genuine closeness approaches, less likely to produce the specific, costly pattern of reaching and retreating that the avoidant dynamic generates. Not healed in the clean, complete, nothing remaining set sense, but genuinely different in the direction of more honesty about what the interior actually contains, and more willingness to let that honesty find expression in the world. Whether that person then has anything to offer that would be relevant to the empath's life, whether the changed avoidant, at whatever point in the future the genuine change manifests, is someone who's demonstrated, behavioral, sufficient for what she needs presence in a relationship, would be something the empath would choose, is a question that belongs entirely to her, not to the dynamic, not to the psychology, not to the explanation of what no contact produces, or why dismissive avoidants fall in love with empaths they rejected, or any of the other frameworks this series has been building. To her. To her means to the actual daily, genuinely inhabited version of a person who has done the work of returning to herself and is living the life that work made possible. The question of whether a changed avoidant, at some future point, would be someone she would choose is not a question she is sitting with right now. It is not a question her current life is organized around. It is a hypothetical that the framework can describe without her needing to orient toward it in any practical sense. What she is oriented toward is what she has been oriented toward throughout the genuine, hard-won, nothing shortcutted process of everything this examination has traced. Her own life, her own interior. The genuine, reciprocal, shows up in the world connection that she deserves and that she will recognize clearly, immediately, with the specific certainty of the instrument that everything she has been through has calibrated, when it presents itself in someone capable of providing it. That recognition is not something she has to work for. It is not something she has to develop or practice or consciously deploy. It is simply what she is now. The person who has been through this arc is not the same person who entered it. She carries different information, more precise information. The specific, embodied, non-theoretical information of someone who has intimate familiarity with the difference between genuine presence and managed proximity, between depth that is available and depth that is visible but unreachable, between someone who moves toward the real version of her and someone who manages a safe distance from it. She will not mistake one for the other, not again. Not because she has become closed or defended or less willing to bring her full extraordinary self to genuine connection, but because she is more herself now than she was before, more precise in what she is and what she requires, more able to feel, in the early moments of a new connection, whether what is being offered is the real thing or a version of the familiar pattern presenting itself in a new context. The familiar pattern will present itself in new contexts. That is worth saying directly rather than leaving as an implication. The specific avoidant-empath dynamic is not unique to one person. The quality that the empath carries, the depth, the genuine perception, the warmth directed at the real version rather than the managed surface, is the quality that consistently activates the avoidant psychology's most complex and most defended response. She will encounter this again, perhaps not with the same intensity, perhaps not in the same configuration, but the dynamic that produces the reaching and the retreating, the genuine interior investment and the insufficient exterior expression, the claiming in the mind and the withholding in the life, that dynamic is not a one-time occurrence. What is different now is her capacity to feel the dynamic beginning without being already in it before she has registered what is happening, her ability to read the early signals, the specific quality of someone whose engagement is with the real version, but whose behavioral expression is consistently insufficient, and to respond to what the signals actually indicate rather than to what the hope would prefer them to indicate. Her willingness to act on what she reads, to trust the instrument, to honor what she knows at the level of knowing that requires action, rather than simply the level of knowing that permits continued hoping. That willingness, to act on knowing rather than waiting for the knowing to be comfortable or convenient or confirmed by enough accumulation of painful evidence that it becomes impossible to continue ignoring, is the most practical, most daily useful thing this entire arc has produced. The avoidant solitude is changed. The 7 strange behaviors run their course. The interior question is being asked, or is being managed past, or is somewhere in the complicated non-linear process between those two options that most genuine psychological movement occupies. All of that is true. All of that is real. All of it is happening on the other side of a silence that the empath created, and that belongs to her, and that is doing for her what silence genuinely claimed as one's own always does. It is clearing.